The machine stopped beeping at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in March. Daniel's hand had been growing cold in mine for the past hour, but I kept holding on, whispering promises about how we'd travel to Italy once he got better, how we'd finally renovate that kitchen he'd been sketching plans for. The doctors had said his recovery was unlikely after the car accident, but Daniel had always been stubborn about impossible things. Right until the very end. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His eyes fluttered open one last time, unfocused and distant, but his grip on my hand suddenly tightened with surprising strength. His voice came out as barely a whisper, each word requiring tremendous effort. Rachel, 1247 Mountain View Drive, Asheville. He paused, struggling for breath. Tell them Daniel sent you. They deserve to know. His eyes found mine for just a moment, filled with something I couldn't identify. Regret, maybe, or desperation. Then his hand went limp, and the monitor flatlined. I sat there in the sterile hospital room, staring at his peaceful face while those words echoed in my mind. An address. In North Carolina, 800 miles from our Portland home. Tell them Daniel sent you. Who was them? In 12 years of marriage, Daniel had never mentioned knowing anyone in Asheville. We'd never even visited North Carolina together. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences. Our friends from the neighborhood gathered in our living room, sharing memories of Daniel's terrible dad jokes and his obsession with fixing things that weren't broken. My sister Nicole flew in from Seattle, taking charge of arrangements with the efficiency that made her such a successful project manager. My mother arrived with her usual arsenal of advice about moving forward and staying strong, as if grief operated on the same timeline as her weekly meal prep. You need to think practically now, Rachel, she said while organizing sympathy cards into neat piles on the kitchen counter. The house is too big for one person, and that little marketing business of yours won't cover the mortgage forever. Maybe it's time to consider selling and finding something smaller. I nodded absently, still hearing Daniel's last words on repeat. 1247 Mountain View Drive. The address had been written on a scrap of paper and tucked into my purse for 3 days now, like a secret I wasn't ready to share. Every time I pulled out my keys or searched for a pen, my fingers brushed against that folded paper, and I felt a strange mix of curiosity and dread. Did Daniel ever mention having friends in North Carolina? I asked Nicole while we sorted through his clothes. She paused, holding one of his favorite flannel shirts against her chest. North Carolina? No, why would he? You know Daniel never talked about his time before Portland. He always said his real life started when he met you. She smiled sadly. Remember how he used to joke that he'd lived 28 years of practice life before figuring out how to do it right? That was true. Daniel had always been vague about his past, deflecting questions with humor or changing the subject entirely. I'd assumed it was because his childhood had been difficult. Parents who died young, foster care, the kind of background that some people preferred to leave buried. He'd presented himself as someone who believed in moving forward rather than dwelling on what came before. It had seemed romantic at the time, this idea that our life together was all that mattered. But now, sorting through his belongings, I realized how little concrete information I actually had about the man I'd been married to for over a decade. His box of important documents contained our marriage certificate, insurance papers, and mortgage information, but nothing from before we met. No childhood photos, no high school yearbooks, no letters from old friends. It was as if Daniel Barnes had materialized fully formed at age 28, the day he walked into the coffee shop where I was working on a freelance project and asked if the seat across from me was taken. The morning after Nicole returned to Seattle, I sat in Daniel's home office, ostensibly cleaning out his desk but really searching for clues about that mysterious address. His computer was password protected, and none of my usual guesses worked. Not our anniversary, not my birthday, not the name of our first dog. I tried variations of Mountain View Drive, Asheville, even random number combinations, but the screen remained locked. His desk drawers yielded the usual office supplies and a few business cards from potential clients he'd been courting for his carpentry business. Daniel had been talented with his hands, able to transform rough lumber into beautiful custom furniture that our friends constantly admired. He'd been building a steady clientele of homeowners who wanted something unique and handcrafted rather than mass-produced. The business had been growing slowly but steadily, and we'd talked about him eventually quitting his day job at the hardware store to focus on woodworking full-time. In the bottom drawer, tucked behind a stack of invoices, I found something odd, a prepaid cell phone I'd never seen before. It was an older model, the kind you might buy at a gas station for emergencies. When I powered it on, the battery was nearly dead, but it showed a call history that made my stomach drop. Dozens of calls to the same North Carolina area code over the past 2 years. The most recent call had been made just 3 days before the accident. I plugged the phone into Daniel's charger and scrolled through the sparse contact list. Only 3 numbers were saved. One was labeled C and had been called most frequently. Another was labeled School and had been called about once a month. The third was labeled Dr. Peterson and had been called only a few times. All had the same 828 area code. My hands trembled as I pressed call on the number labeled C. It rang twice before a woman's voice answered, warm and familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. "Daniel? Thank God, I've been trying to reach you for days. Tyler's been asking when you're coming home, and Sophie's piano recital is this Friday. You promised you'd be here." I couldn't speak, the woman continued, her tone shifting from relief to concern. "Daniel? Is everything okay? You sound different." "This isn't Daniel," I managed to say, my voice barely audible. This is his wife." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had disconnected. Then, in a voice completely different from before, guarded, careful, she asked, "His wife?" "Yes. From Portland, Oregon. Daniel was in an accident last week. He died 3 days ago." I heard a sharp intake of breath, then what sounded like a chair scraping against a floor. No, that's not possible. Daniel doesn't have a wife. Daniel is my husband. We've been married for 14 years. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the desk. I stared at it as if it might transform into something less devastating, but the woman's voice continued speaking, tinny and distant from the desktop. "Hello. Are you still there? Who is this, really? Because Daniel Barnes has been my husband since 2009, and we have 2 children together. If this is some kind of sick joke..." I picked up the phone with numb fingers. "What did you say your name was?" "Caroline. Caroline Barnes. And you need to explain to me right now what kind of game you're playing." Caroline Barnes. She had the same last name. She called him her husband. She mentioned children. Tyler and Sophie, my Daniel, who'd always claimed he'd never wanted kids, who'd convinced me we were complete as just the 2 of us. My Daniel, who'd supposedly met me when he was 28 and inexperienced with love. "I'm not playing a game," I whispered. "I have a marriage certificate dated June 15, 2011. Daniel Barnes, age 30. Rachel Mitchell, age 26. We lived at 847 Birch Street in Portland, Oregon. He worked at Cascade Hardware and built custom furniture on weekends. He told me he'd never been married before." The silence stretched again. When Caroline spoke, her voice was hollow. June 15, 2011. That was exactly 2 years after our wedding. Tyler was 1 year old. She paused, and I could hear muffled voices in the background, as if she'd covered the phone to speak to someone else. "You said he died in an accident?" "A car accident. Last Tuesday night. He was coming home from a job site and someone ran a red light. He was in the hospital for 4 days before." I couldn't finish the sentence. "Oh my God." Caroline's voice cracked. "The kids. How am I going to tell the kids? Tyler's only 13, and Sophie just turned 10. They worship their father. He was supposed to come home next week. He always comes home. Always comes home. Next week. The words hit me like physical blows. Daniel hadn't been traveling for work like he'd told me during his frequent absences. He'd been visiting his other family. His real family, apparently, since they'd been married first. "Where are you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Asheville, North Carolina, 1247 Mountain View Drive." She gave the address automatically, then seemed to realize what she'd said. "Wait, how did you get this number? How did you know to call me?" "Daniel gave me your address. Right before he died, he said to tell them Daniel sent me. He said they deserved to know." Caroline made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. Typical Daniel. Even dying, he couldn't just tell the truth directly. Had to leave riddles and make other people clean up his mess. The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. It was also completely justified. How long had she known? Had she suspected Daniel was leading a double life? Or had this revelation hit her as hard as it had hit me?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Did you know?" I asked. "About me, I mean. About Portland?" I knew something was wrong. Daniel claimed he had work contracts that required him to travel monthly, sometimes for weeks at a time. He said it was construction projects in remote areas with no cell service. But he always had money when he came back, and he never wanted to talk about the details. When I pressed him, he'd get defensive and say I didn't trust him. She paused, and I heard what sounded like a door closing. He was different when he came back from trips. Distant. Guilty. He'd overcompensate by buying expensive gifts for the kids or planning elaborate weekend activities. I started thinking he was having an affair, but I never imagined. Her voice trailed off. "You never imagined he had a whole other life." I finished for her. A whole other wife. A whole other house. God, how did he manage it? The logistics alone must have been exhausting. I thought about Daniel's frequent work trips, his claims about demanding clients who required on-site consultations. He'd been gone at least 1 week every month for the past 2 years, sometimes longer. I'd supported his dedication to building his business, proud of his work ethic and craftsmanship. I'd packed his lunches and kissed him goodbye, never questioning why his clients were always located in areas with poor cell service. "The money," I said suddenly. How did he afford 2 households, 2 mortgages, 2 sets of bills? Caroline laughed bitterly. Daniel was good with money. Scarily good. He had multiple income streams, the construction work, day trading, some kind of consulting business. He handled all our finances. I knew we were comfortable, but I trusted him to manage the details. She paused. I guess now I know why he was so secretive about the bank accounts. My head was spinning. The Daniel I'd known had been terrible with money, always leaving financial planning to me. He'd contributed to our household expenses from his hardware store job and occasional furniture commissions. But we'd lived modestly, carefully budgeting for small luxuries like dinner out or weekend trips to the coast. Caroline, I said carefully, I need to see you. I need to understand what happened here. Would it be okay if I came to Asheville? You want to come here? To our house? Her voice rose slightly. Daniel asked me to. His last words were your address and a message that you deserve to know. I think he wanted me to find you, to tell you what happened. Maybe there are things we both need to understand. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Finally she spoke, her voice weary. You can come, but I want you to know that this house has been Daniel's home for 14 years. These children have known him as their father since they were born. Whatever he was to you in Portland, here he was ours first. The words stung, but I understood her need to claim territory, to establish some kind of hierarchy in this impossible situation. I understand. I'll drive down this weekend. Drive carefully, she said, and there was something almost absurd about the automatic politeness in the middle of such a surreal conversation. I'll text you when I figure out how to tell the kids that their father is dead and had a secret wife. After she hung up, I sat in Daniel's office chair, surrounded by the remnants of a life I was beginning to realize I'd never really understood. The man I'd grieved for the past week had been a stranger wearing the face of my husband. Every memory felt contaminated now, every conversation reframed by the knowledge that he'd been dividing his attention, his affection, his very identity between two completely separate worlds. I looked around the office that had always seemed like Daniel's private sanctuary. Now I wondered what else he'd been hiding. The locked computer, the secret phone, the vague past. They weren't quirks of personality anymore. They were deliberate constructions designed to keep his two lives from colliding. Standing up on unsteady legs, I walked to the window that overlooked our backyard. Daniel had spent countless hours out there, building raised garden beds and a pergola where we'd planned to grow morning glories. He'd talked about the therapeutic nature of working with his hands, how it helped him process stress and stay grounded. Now I wondered if it had been guilt he was trying to work through, the weight of maintaining such an elaborate deception. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown North Carolina number. "This is Caroline. I told the kids their father died in an accident. I haven't told them about you yet. Tyler wants to know if you'll be at the funeral. I don't know what to tell him." I stared at the message, reality crashing over me in waves. There would be two sets of people grieving Daniel Barnes. Two families devastated by his loss. Two wives trying to understand how they'd been sharing a husband without knowing it. And somewhere in Asheville, two children were learning that their father wasn't coming home, while having no idea that their entire understanding of his life was about to be shattered. Sitting down at the kitchen table where Daniel and I had eaten breakfast together thousands of times, I opened my laptop and booked a flight to Charlotte with a connecting drive to Asheville. Whatever I found at 1247 Mountain View Drive, it couldn't be worse than the questions that were eating me alive in Portland. I needed to see this other family, to understand how Daniel had managed to love them while claiming to love me. I needed to know which version of my husband had been real, or if any of it had been real at all. The house felt different now, full of shadows and secrets I'd been blind to before. As I packed a suitcase for North Carolina, I caught myself looking at familiar objects. Our wedding photos, the coffee mug Daniel used every morning, the throw pillows he'd complained about but never asked me to remove, and wondering what else I'd failed to see. How many other lies had I accepted as truth? How many other families might be out there, grieving a man they thought belonged exclusively to them? My hands shook as I folded clothes into the suitcase. In less than 48 hours, I would knock on the door of a house where my husband had lived another life entirely. I would meet children who called him dad and a woman who called him husband, and somehow we would all have to figure out how to grieve the same man who had betrayed us all in different ways. The last thing I packed was the scrap of paper with the address written in my own handwriting, copied from Daniel's dying words. 1247 Mountain View Drive, Asheville. It felt like a treasure map leading to a treasure I wasn't sure I wanted to find. But Daniel had used his final breath to send me there, and after 12 years of marriage, I owed it to both of us to discover what he'd been so desperate for me to know. The flight to Charlotte felt endless. I stared out the airplane window at clouds that looked like cotton balls scattered across a blue tablecloth, trying to process the conversation I'd had with Caroline Barnes. Every few minutes, the reality would hit me again like a physical blow. My husband had been married to someone else first. He had children. He had been living a completely different life 800 miles away, and I had been nothing more than an elaborate lie he told himself during his monthly escapes. The rental car smelled like artificial pine and disappointment. I programmed the GPS for Asheville, watching the estimated arrival time flash on the screen, 4 hours and 37 minutes. 4.5 hours to mentally prepare for meeting the woman who had been sharing my husband without either of us knowing it. 4.5 hours to figure out what I was going to say to children who had just lost their father and were about to learn their entire understanding of him was false. Highway 40 stretched ahead through mountains that grew more dramatic with each passing mile. Daniel had always talked about wanting to visit the Blue Ridge Mountains someday. Now I wondered if he'd been describing memories rather than dreams, recounting family vacations he'd taken with Caroline and their children while pretending it was all hypothetical future planning with me. I stopped for gas in a small town called Hickory, standing beside the rental car while the tank filled and trying to call my sister Nicole. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. "Hey, it's me. I said to her, recording. I'm driving to North Carolina to follow up on something Daniel mentioned before he died. I know that sounds cryptic, but I'll explain when I get back. I just wanted someone to know where I was going. I paused, unsure how much to reveal even to my own sister. If you don't hear from me by tomorrow night, call me, okay? Love you. The gas station attendant gave me directions to a local diner that served what he promised was the best sweet tea in 3 counties. I wasn't particularly hungry, but the thought of sitting in a neutral space for a few minutes before continuing to Asheville felt appealing. The diner was exactly what I'd expected: red vinyl booths, a pie case near the register, and waitresses who called everyone honey. You passing through or visiting family? The waitress asked while refilling my coffee cup. She wore a name tag that read Dolores, and had the kind of warm smile that made you want to confess your problems. Visiting, I said, which wasn't exactly a lie. Going to Asheville to see some people I've never met before. Dolores raised an eyebrow. That's an interesting way to put it. Business or pleasure? Neither, I said honestly, more like solving a mystery. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Well, Asheville's a good place for mysteries. Lots of folks up there living unconventional lives. Artists and writers and people who came to reinvent themselves. You might find more than you bargained for. Her words followed me back to the car. People who came to reinvent themselves. Is that what Daniel had done? Had he run away from some previous life and created a new identity in Asheville, only to repeat the pattern when he met me in Portland? How many other Daniel Barnes might there be scattered across the country? The mountains grew higher as I approached Asheville, their peaks shrouded in mist that looked almost supernatural. I'd never been to this part of the country before, and the landscape felt foreign in a way that made Daniel's secret life seem even more surreal. This was where he'd chosen to build his first family, in this place of rolling hills and winding roads that bore no resemblance to the urban neighborhoods of Portland, where we'd made our home. Mountain View Drive turned out to be exactly what its name suggested. A winding road that climbs steadily upward, offering glimpses of the valley below through breaks in the trees. The houses were spaced far apart, each one nestled into its own patch of forest. Number 1247 Saturday at the end of a gravel driveway, a 2-story cabin with a wraparound porch and flower boxes under every window. It looked like something from a magazine about mountain living. Rustic but well-maintained, with Daniel's careful attention to detail evident in every board and beam. I sat in the rental car at the bottom of the driveway for 10 minutes, engine running, trying to summon the courage to drive up to the house. Through the trees I could see a swing set in the backyard and what looked like a vegetable garden. Normal family things. The kind of domestic touches that Daniel and I had never quite managed in our Portland house, despite all our good intentions. Finally, I turned off the engine and walked up the driveway on unsteady legs. The porch steps creaked under my feet, a homey sound that made my chest tight. Before I could knock, the front door opened, and I found myself face to face with Caroline Barnes. She was beautiful in a way that made me immediately self-conscious. Tall and athletic, with the kind of effortless grace that suggested she spent time outdoors. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore jeans and a flannel shirt that looked comfortable and practical. She looked like the kind of woman who could change her own oil and bake bread from scratch, the kind of woman who belonged in a mountain cabin with a man who built furniture with his hands. "Rachel?" she asked, and I nodded, unable to speak. She studied my face with obvious curiosity, as if looking for resemblances to someone we both knew. "You look exactly like I imagined you would." "What do you mean?" Daniel had a type, apparently. We could be sisters. It was true. We had the same basic build, the same coloring, even similar hairstyles. The realization was disturbing in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Had Daniel been trying to recreate something when he chose me? Had I been a replacement for the wife he'd left behind in North Carolina? "Come in," Caroline said, stepping aside to let me pass. "The kids are at school, so we can talk freely. They don't know about you yet." The interior of the house was everything the outside had promised. exposed wooden beams, stone fireplace, and furniture that I recognized as Daniel's work. Every piece bore his distinctive style. Clean lines, perfect joints, wood chosen for its natural beauty rather than convenience. The coffee table in the living room was identical to one he'd made for our Portland home, except this version was obviously years older. "He built most of this furniture when we first moved in," Caroline said, following my gaze. "Back when he still had time for personal projects. Before the traveling started eating up his weekends." I ran my hand along the arm of a rocking chair that could have been the twin to one Daniel had crafted for our bedroom. "How long has he been traveling for work?" "About 3 years. It started gradually, just a weekend here and there for special projects. Then it became monthly trips, sometimes longer. He said the construction industry was changing, that remote work sites paid better but required more time away from home." 3 years. The timeline made my stomach clench. Daniel and I had been having problems around that time, a rough patch where we'd considered couples counseling. I'd attributed our distance to work stress and the normal challenges of long-term marriage. Now I wondered if he'd been planning his escape, laying the groundwork for a life that would let him disappear periodically without raising suspicions. "Can I ask you something personal?" Caroline said, settling into the chair across from me. "How did you two meet?" I told her about the coffee shop, about Daniel's claim that he'd never experienced real love before meeting me, about his vague references to a difficult past and his insistence that our life together was the only one that mattered. Caroline listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "He told me almost the exact same story," she said finally. "Except in his version, he'd been drifting from job to job before we met, never finding anything that felt like home. He said I was the first person who made him want to settle down and build something permanent." "When did you get married?" "June 2009. Right here in this living room, actually. Just immediate family and a few close friends. Daniel said he didn't want anything fancy, that the important thing was making the commitment, not throwing a party." She gestured toward a framed photo on the mantel, showing her and Daniel in wedding attire, standing in front of the stone fireplace. "What about you two?" "June 2011. Portland City Hall." Daniel said the same thing about not wanting anything elaborate. I paused, doing the math. "Your wedding was exactly 2 years before ours." "To the month," Caroline confirmed. "That can't be a coincidence." We sat in uncomfortable silence, both processing the implication. Daniel hadn't stumbled into bigamy by accident. He'd planned it, choosing the same anniversary month for both marriages, perhaps as some twisted way of keeping his lies organized. "Carolyn," I said carefully, "did Daniel ever mention feeling trapped? Like he needed to escape sometimes?" She considered the question seriously. "Not trapped, exactly, but restless. Especially after Tyler was born. He loved being a father, but I think the responsibility scared him. He'd disappear into his workshop for hours working on projects that didn't seem to have any practical purpose. Just cutting and sanding and building things we didn't need. He did the same thing in Portland. I thought it was therapeutic for him. Maybe it was. Or maybe it was practice." Caroline stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the backyard. "You know what I keep thinking about? All the times he came back from his work trips, acting different, guilty and overcompensating. I assumed he was having affairs. Were you okay with that? The thought that he might be cheating?" Caroline turned back to face me, her expression rueful. "I wasn't okay with it, but I'd made peace with it. I figured as long as he came home to us, as long as he was a good father to the kids, I could live with him having something on the side. It's terrible to admit that, but I didn't want to break up our family over what I assumed were meaningless flings." "They weren't meaningless," I said quietly. "I wasn't meaningless. We had a real marriage, a real relationship. I loved him completely." "I know." Caroline's voice was gentle. "That's what makes this so much worse than simple cheating. He didn't just betray our marriages. He created a whole other person, lived a whole other life. The Daniel who came home to me after his trips was always a little different from the Daniel who left. Now I understand why. A car door slammed outside, followed by the sound of young voices. Carolyn glanced at the clock on the mantel. The kids are home early. I told them about Daniel yesterday, but I haven't figured out how to explain the rest of it. She looked at me with something like panic in her eyes. I'm not ready for them to meet you. I can leave, I offered quickly. Come back later, or tomorrow. No. Carolyn's voice was firm. Daniel wanted you to meet them. He said they deserve to know. We need to figure out what that means. The front door burst open, and 2 children rushed into the living room, backpacks flying in different directions. The boy was tall for what I guessed was 13, with Daniel's dark hair and serious eyes. The girl was smaller, probably 10, with Caroline's delicate features but Daniel's stubborn chin. Mom, is it true that Dad's truck is still at McCarthy's garage? The boy asked without preamble. Jake Morrison said his dad saw it there and they only keep vehicles there when the owners are… He stopped mid-sentence, noticing me for the first time. Tyler, Sophie, this is Rachel, Caroline said, her voice carefully controlled. She was a friend of your father's. She came to pay her respects. Sophie studied me with the intense scrutiny that only children could manage. You don't look like Dad's other friends. Were you his girlfriend or something? Sophie, Tyler hissed, clearly mortified by his sister's directness. It's okay, I said, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Your father and I knew each other in Portland, Oregon, where he did some of his construction work. Dad never talked about Oregon, Sophie said, settling onto the couch beside her mother. He said most of his work trips were boring. Nothing interesting ever happened. The casual dismissal of my entire existence stung more than it should have. To Daniel's children, I had been nothing interesting. Just another anonymous work obligation that took their father away from home. How long did you know our dad? Tyler asked, and I could see Carolyn tense beside him. Several years, I said carefully. He was very talented at his work. He built beautiful things. He was going to teach me woodworking this summer, Tyler said, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. We were going to build a treehouse together. He drew up plans and everything. Sophie leaned against her mother's arm. He promised to come to my piano recital next week. I've been practicing the same song for 2 months because he said it was his favorite. Listening to them talk about their father, I felt a strange combination of jealousy and grief. These children had known a version of Daniel that I'd never seen. A man who made promises about tree houses and attended piano recitals. A man who was present and engaged, not constantly distracted by the weight of maintaining parallel lives. Your father loved you both very much, I said, and meant it. Whatever else Daniel had done, whatever lies he'd told, his love for these children seemed genuine. He talked about you sometimes, when he was in Portland. It was a lie, but a kind one. Tyler's face brightened slightly. He did. What did he say? I scrambled for details that might comfort him without revealing too much. He said you were interested in building things, like he was, and he mentioned that Sophie was musical, very talented. Did he ever show you pictures of us? Sophie asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel had never shown me pictures of his children because I hadn't known they existed. But admitting that would lead to questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Your father was private about personal things, I said finally. But I could tell when he talked about family that it meant everything to him. Caroline shot me a grateful look. We were walking a tightrope, trying to honor these children's grief while protecting them from the full truth of their father's deception. Are you going to Dad's funeral? Tyler asked. Mom said there might be one in Oregon too, for his work friends. Tyler, Caroline warned gently, we've talked about this. The arrangements are complicated. I don't understand why everything has to be so complicated, Sophie said, her voice rising with frustration. Why can't we just have a funeral like normal people? Why does everyone keep acting like there's some big secret? Out of the mouths of babes. Sophie had identified exactly what was wrong with this entire situation. There was a big secret, and it was poisoning even their ability to grieve properly. Your mom is doing her best to handle a difficult situation, I said carefully. Sometimes adult problems don't have simple solutions. Are you going to stay for dinner? Sophie asked suddenly. Mom's making Dad's favorite lasagna. She thought it might help us feel better. The invitation was innocent, but it felt like a trap. Sitting around the dinner table where Daniel had eaten hundreds of meals with his first family seemed like a betrayal of something, though I wasn't sure what. I'm staying in town tonight, I said. But maybe we could spend some time together tomorrow, if that's okay with your mom. Caroline nodded, though I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Rachel, why don't you come back tomorrow afternoon? The kids will be at school in the morning, and we can talk more. Then maybe we can all have dinner together. After I left, I drove aimlessly through Asheville's downtown, trying to process what I'd learned. The children were lovely, clearly well-loved and well cared for. Caroline was handling an impossible situation with grace and strength. Daniel had built a beautiful life here, complete with the kind of family stability he'd always claimed to want. So why had he left? Why had he felt compelled to create a second life in Portland, complete with a second wife, who thought she was his first and only? What had been missing from his mountain paradise that he'd needed to seek elsewhere? I checked into a hotel downtown and spent the evening walking through the city's arts district, trying to understand what had drawn Daniel to this place. Asheville had a creative energy that Portland lacked, a sense of community and authenticity that seemed to encourage people to reinvent themselves. Maybe that's what Daniel had been doing repeatedly, reinventing himself whenever his current life started to feel too small or confining. That night, lying in an unfamiliar hotel bed, I called my sister Nicole. Rachel, thank God. I was starting to worry when I got your cryptic message. Where are you exactly? North Carolina, Asheville. It's a long story. I have time, start talking. So I told her everything. The secret phone, the conversation with Caroline, the meeting with Daniel's children. Nicole listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief or sympathy. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, holy shit, Rachel. Holy fucking shit. I know. Are you okay? Obviously you're not okay, but are you safe? Do you need me to come down there? I'm safe. Caroline isn't the enemy here. She's nice. Really nice. Under different circumstances, I think we'd be friends. And the kids? Heartbreaking. They're just kids who lost their dad and don't understand why everything feels so complicated and secretive. Nicole was quiet again. What are you going to do? I don't know. Daniel wanted me to come here, to tell them something. But I'm not sure what. And I'm not sure how much truth they can handle right now. Maybe the question isn't how much truth they can handle, Nicole said carefully. Maybe the question is how much truth you can handle. Are you sure you want to dig deeper into this? Some secrets might be better left buried. Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. Part of me wanted to return to Portland immediately, to pretend this other family didn't exist, to preserve what remained of my marriage to Daniel. But another part of me needed to understand how this had happened, how a man I'd lived with for 12 years had managed to maintain such an elaborate deception. More than that, I felt a strange obligation to Caroline and her children. They were grieving the same man I was grieving, and they deserved to know the truth about who he'd really been, even if that truth was complicated and painful. Tomorrow, I would go back to 1247 Mountain View Drive. I would sit in Daniel's living room, surrounded by furniture he'd built with his own hands, and try to piece together the puzzle of a man who'd lived multiple lives simultaneously. I would look into the faces of his children and try to find a way to honor their father's memory, while acknowledging the scope of his betrayal. And somehow, in the process, I would try to figure out who I was now that everything I'd believed about my marriage had been proven false. The woman who'd driven into Asheville that morning was not the same woman lying in this hotel bed. Tomorrow would require becoming someone new entirely. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that changed everything. I was drinking coffee in the hotel restaurant, staring out at the mountains and trying to prepare myself for another day of revelations, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a Portland number I didn't recognize. "Is this Rachel Barnes?" The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes, this is Rachel. Mrs. Barnes? This is Detective Morrison with Portland Police. I'm calling about your husband's accident. There are some details we need to discuss with you in person. When will you be returning to Portland?" My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. "Details? What kind of details?" I thought the investigation was closed. The other driver ran a red light. Wasn't that clear? Detective Morrison paused. "Ma'am, I'd prefer to discuss this face-to-face. Are you currently out of town?" "I'm in North Carolina. Family business related to Daniel's death. Can you tell me what this is about?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Barnes, there are some inconsistencies in your husband's case that we're looking into. Financial irregularities, questions about his employment history. We've also received some information from his bank that raises additional questions." The restaurant suddenly felt too warm. "What kind of financial irregularities?" "I really can't discuss details over the phone, but I will say this. Your husband had significantly more assets than what you declared on his insurance paperwork. Multiple accounts, some under different variations of his name. We need to understand the scope of his financial arrangements." My hands began to shake. "Are you saying Daniel was involved in something illegal?" "I'm saying we need to talk. How soon can you return to Portland?" I told him I'd be back within a few days and hung up, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet once again. Just when I thought I understood the scope of Daniel's deception, new layers kept revealing themselves. Financial irregularities. Multiple accounts. Different variations of his name. I called Caroline immediately. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. "Rachel, is everything okay? You sound upset." "Caroline, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did Daniel ever have money problems? Or the opposite, did he ever have more money than his work could account for?" Silence. "Then, why are you asking?" "Portland Police just called. They're investigating Daniel's finances. They say he had multiple bank accounts and significantly more assets than I knew about." "Oh, God." Caroline's voice was barely a whisper. "I was hoping this wouldn't come out." "You knew?" "I suspected. Rachel, Daniel didn't just travel for construction work. He was involved in some kind of consulting business that I never fully understood. He said it was technical advising for construction companies, helping them optimize their projects. But the money he brought home was way more than any consulting fee should have been." I felt dizzy. "How much money are we talking about?" "Our bank accounts have over $200,000 in them, just in checking and savings. And there are investment accounts I don't have access to. Daniel always said he was planning for the kids, college, and our retirement, but I never understood how we could afford to save so much. $200,000. Daniel and I had struggled to keep $5,000 in our emergency fund. We'd driven used cars and shopped at discount stores and carefully budgeted for small luxuries, like dinner out once a month. Caroline, I think Daniel might have been living more than two lives. I think there's more we don't know." "What do you mean?" "Think about it. He was supporting two households, two families. Even with higher-paying consulting work, that shouldn't have been possible unless he was making a lot more money than either of us realized. And now the police are mentioning multiple accounts under different variations of his name." Caroline was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, "There's something else. Daniel had a storage unit here in Asheville. He said it was for his woodworking tools and extra materials, but he never let me go there with him. He was very secretive about it." "Do you have the key?" "It's on his keychain. I haven't been able to bring myself to go through his personal things yet, but I could find it." "Caroline, I think we need to check that storage unit. And I think we need to do it today, before I have to go back to Portland and deal with the police." An hour later, I was back at 1247 Mountain View Drive, Caroline met me at the door with a set of keys and an expression of grim determination. "The kids are at school until 3, she said. "That gives us 5 hours to figure out what your husband was hiding." "Your husband. Not our husband." The subtle shift in language felt significant, as if Caroline was beginning to distance herself from the man we'd both thought we knew. The storage facility was on the outskirts of Asheville, a sprawling complex of beige metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing. Unit 247 was in the back section, away from the main office and the more frequently accessed units. Caroline's hands shook as she fumbled with the lock. "I'm scared," she admitted as the metal door began to roll upward. "What if we find something terrible?" The storage unit was larger than I'd expected, about the size of a single-car garage. But instead of woodworking tools and construction materials, it was filled with filing cabinets, boxes of documents, and several computers. It looked like an office, complete with a desk, chairs, and multiple phone lines. "This isn't a workshop," Caroline said unnecessarily. We spent the next 3 hours going through Daniel's secret office. What we found was worse than either of us had imagined. Daniel hadn't just been living a double life. He'd been running a sophisticated identity theft operation. The filing cabinets contained hundreds of stolen Social Security numbers, credit reports, and personal information. The computers had software for creating fake documents and multiple email accounts under dozens of different names. "Look at this," Caroline said, holding up a folder marked Active Projects. Inside were detailed profiles of elderly individuals across multiple states, complete with their financial information, daily routines, and family relationships. He was targeting senior citizens. My stomach turned as I read through the files. Daniel had been systematically stealing from vulnerable people, using their identities to open credit accounts and take out loans. The operation was extensive and well-organized, with spreadsheets tracking his victims and their available credit limits. "Here's another folder," I said, my voice hollow. "It's labeled Families." Inside were profiles of widows and single mothers, women who were struggling financially and unlikely to have the resources to fight back if they discovered the fraud. Daniel had been preying on people like us, people who trusted too easily and loved too completely. But the worst discovery was yet to come. In the bottom drawer of one of the filing cabinets, Caroline found a folder with both our names on it. "Rachel?" she called, her voice strange. "You need to see this." The folder contained detailed background checks on both of us, complete with our financial information, employment histories, and psychological profiles. There were notes in Daniel's handwriting analyzing our personalities, our vulnerabilities, and our potential usefulness to his operation. About Caroline, he'd written, "Trusting, family-focused, unlikely to question financial arrangements if convinced they benefit the children. Good cover for establishing permanent base of operations." About me, he'd written, "Isolated from family, financially dependent, artistic temperament, suggests emotional decision-making over logical analysis. Ideal for secondary location and backup plan. We weren't his wives, we were his marks. Carefully selected victims who'd been manipulated into providing him with cover, stability, and access to clean credit histories. Our marriages had been part of his criminal enterprise." Caroline sat down heavily on one of the chairs, the folder falling from her hands. 14 years, she whispered. 14 years of my life. 2 children, and I was nothing but a business arrangement to him. I picked up the folder and read through Daniel's notes about us again, looking for something that might suggest genuine emotion, real love beneath the calculation. There was nothing. Every detail of our relationships had been analyzed for its utility to his criminal operation. "The money," I said suddenly. "Caroline, if Daniel was stealing identities and opening fraudulent accounts, there might be debts we don't know about. Credit cards, loans, mortgages taken out in names that could be traced back to us." Her face went pale. "You think we could be held responsible for his crimes?" "I don't know. But we need to document everything here before we call the police. We need to show that we were victims too, not accomplices." We spent the next 2 hours photographing documents and copying files onto a flash drive. The scope of Daniel's operation was staggering. He'd been active in at least 12 states, with hundreds of victims and millions of dollars in fraudulent activity. He'd used our homes as business addresses, our computers for research, and our reputations as cover for his criminal activities. There's something else, Caroline said, pointing to a calendar on the wall. Look at his travel schedule. The calendar showed a pattern more complex than we'd realized. Daniel hadn't just been traveling between Asheville and Portland. There were trips to Florida, Texas, Arizona, and Nevada, marked on specific dates, always with initials that corresponded to files in his cabinets. He had other operations, I said, understanding dawning. Other identities, maybe other families. Dear God, Caroline breathed. How many of us are there? We found the answer in a locked file cabinet that Caroline finally managed to open with bolt cutters we'd found in the storage unit. Inside was a folder labeled Current Operations that contained information about 5 different identities Daniel had been maintaining. In Tampa, Florida, he was David Brennan, married to Maria Brennan with 3 children. In Phoenix, Arizona, he was Dan Bradley, married to Jennifer Bradley with 1 child. In Las Vegas, Nevada, he was Dennis Banks, apparently unmarried but in a long-term relationship with Susan Torres. Each identity had its own social security number, credit history, and carefully constructed background. 5 families, Caroline said numbly. There are 5 of us. The photographs in each file showed the same pattern. Daniel with different wives, different children, different lives, but always the same calculated smile. He looked genuinely happy in every picture, which somehow made the discovery more horrifying. He'd been a sociopath capable of mimicking love so convincingly that 5 different women had believed they were his one and only. We have to call them, I said. Maria and Jennifer and Susan. They deserve to know. How do you even begin that conversation? Carolyn asked. Hello, stranger. Your husband was my husband too. And also he was a criminal who used all of us as cover for his identity theft operation? Before I could answer, Caroline's phone rang. She looked at the screen and frowned. It's the school. They only call if there's an emergency. She answered quickly. Hello? Yes, this is Caroline Barnes. What? No, that's impossible. Daniel Barnes is dead. He died last week in Oregon. I watched Caroline's face change as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. Yes, I'll be right there, she said finally, hanging up. What happened? Someone claiming to be Daniel Barnes just tried to pick up Tyler and Sophie from school. The office staff recognized the name and called me to verify, but when they asked for identification, the man got aggressive and left. My blood ran cold. Caroline, we need to get to the school right now, and we need to call the police. You think it's connected to all this? She gestured at the evidence of Daniel's criminal operations surrounding us. I think Daniel might have had partners, and I think they just realized that his cover has been blown. We locked the storage unit and drove to the school in Caroline's car, my mind racing through the implications. If Daniel had been working with other criminals, they would know about his family arrangements. They would know about Caroline and the children, and probably about me too. They might even know about the other wives and families scattered across the country. The school principal met us in the front office, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a concerned expression. Mrs. Barnes, I'm so sorry for your loss. We were all shocked to hear about Daniel's accident. That's why it was so confusing when someone claiming to be him showed up today. Can you describe the man? I asked, and the principal looked at me curiously. This is Rachel, Caroline explained quickly. She was a friend of Daniel's. She's helping me handle some of the arrangements. Well, he was about the right height and build, but he looked different. Older, maybe, or more worn down. And he couldn't answer basic questions about the children. When I asked Tyler's middle name, he guessed wrong. Caroline and I exchanged glances. Someone had been impersonating Daniel, someone who knew enough about his family to attempt picking up his children, but not enough to answer detailed questions. Did he give you any identification? Caroline asked. He showed me a driver's license, but something about it looked off. That's when I called you to verify. The principal paused. Mrs. Barnes, is there something I should know? Are the children in some kind of danger? Caroline looked at me helplessly. How could we explain that the children's father had been a criminal whose associates might now be targeting his family? We think Daniel might have been involved in some business arrangements that could have put the family at risk. I said carefully. "We're going to be contacting the police to make sure everyone stays safe." The principal nodded seriously. "I'll make sure the office staff knows not to release the children to anyone except you, Mrs. Barnes. And I'll have security keep an extra eye on things." Tyler and Sophie were waiting in the nurse's office, both looking frightened and confused. "Mom?" "Mrs. Patterson said someone was pretending to be Dad," Sophie said, running to Caroline. "Why would someone do that?" "I don't know, sweetheart. But we're going to figure it out." Tyler studied me with the suspicious intelligence of a 13-year-old who knew something was wrong. "Are you really just Dad's friend? Because you seem like more than that." Caroline and I had reached the point where half-truths were no longer sustainable. These children were potentially in danger because of their father's criminal activities. They deserved to know enough to protect themselves. "Tyler, Sophie, we need to have a serious conversation," Caroline said. "About your father, and about some things he was involved in that we're just learning about." "Is that why someone was pretending to be him?" Tyler asked. "We think so, yes." We drove home in tense silence, both children asking questions we weren't ready to answer. Once we were back at the house, Caroline called the local police while I tried to figure out how to contact the other wives. The business of unraveling Daniel's criminal empire was going to be complicated, dangerous, and heartbreaking for everyone involved. But as I sat in Daniel's living room, surrounded by the beautiful furniture he'd built with stolen money and the family he'd deceived for 14 years, I felt something unexpected beginning to grow alongside my anger and grief. It was determination. Maybe even purpose. Daniel had used us all, manipulated us, turned our love into tools for his criminal operation. But he was dead now, and we were still alive. We were still here, and we had each other. Caroline was strong and intelligent. The children were resilient. Even the other wives scattered across the country, once we contacted them, would probably prove to be remarkable women who'd survived an unimaginable betrayal. Daniel had chosen us because he thought we were vulnerable, easy to manipulate, unlikely to fight back. He'd been wrong about that last part. We were going to fight back, not just for ourselves, but for every victim whose identity he'd stolen, every elderly person he'd defrauded, every family he'd destroyed. The man I'd grieved for the past week had never existed. But the woman sitting in his living room, planning how to bring down his criminal operation and protect his victims, she was real. And she was just getting started. 3 years later, I stood in the conference room of my Denver-based cybersecurity firm, looking out at the Colorado skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view never got old. But today, I wasn't admiring the mountains. I was preparing for a presentation that would either launch my company into the national spotlight or destroy everything I'd built since leaving Asheville. The FBI had contacted me 6 months ago. Agent Sarah Martinez had been investigating a massive identity theft ring that spanned multiple states, and my name had come up in their database as both a victim and a key witness. More importantly, the software my company had developed for tracking and preventing identity theft had proven remarkably effective at uncovering the full scope of criminal networks. "Are you ready for this?" asked Marcus Thompson, my business partner, and the closest thing I had to family these days. Marcus was a former FBI forensic accountant who'd helped me understand Daniel's criminal operation and eventually become my co-founder when I decided to turn my nightmare into a mission. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, straightening my tailored jacket. The woman who'd fled Portland 3 years ago in a rental car wouldn't have recognized the person I'd become. That woman had been defined by her relationships, her role as a wife, her small dreams and careful compromises. This woman owned a company worth $12 million and employed 43 people dedicated to protecting victims of financial crime. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. After we'd contacted the FBI about Daniel's storage unit, the investigation had consumed months of my life. There had been depositions, court appearances, and the painful process of reaching out to Daniel's other victims. Maria Brennan in Tampa had been devastated but grateful to finally understand why her husband's behavior had been so erratic. Jennifer Bradley in Phoenix had suspected something was wrong but had been too afraid to investigate. Susan Torres in Las Vegas had been the most shocked of all, since Daniel had promised to marry her as soon as he finalized his divorce from his ex-wife. Each conversation had been like looking into a funhouse mirror of my own experience. We'd all fallen for the same man, believed the same lies, built our lives around someone who'd seen us as nothing more than useful tools. But we'd also all survived his betrayal, and that shared experience had created an unlikely bond between us. It was Maria who'd first suggested we do something constructive with our knowledge. She'd been a software engineer before Daniel convinced her to quit her job and focus on their family. During one of our regular support calls, she'd mentioned how much easier it would have been to detect Daniel's fraud if better monitoring tools had existed. "We understand how these criminals think," she'd said. "We know their patterns, their methods, their psychology. We could build something that would prevent other people from going through what we went through." The idea had taken root slowly. Caroline had insurance money from Daniel's death, plus the proceeds from selling the Asheville house once the police investigation concluded. I had the modest savings Daniel had allowed me to keep, plus a settlement from his criminal enterprise's liquidated assets. Jennifer had a background in business development, and Susan had worked in marketing before Daniel disrupted her career. Together, we'd pooled our resources and our expertise to create Sentinel security solutions. Our flagship product was identity monitoring software that could detect the kind of sophisticated fraud Daniel had specialized in. But our real innovation was the psychological profiling component that helped identify potential victims before they became targets. The Portland presentation went well, Marcus said, reviewing his tablet. The mayor's office was impressed with how our software helped them identify the elderly residents who were most vulnerable to romance scams. Portland. I'd returned to my former city 6 months ago to pilot our software with the local government. It had been surreal walking through neighborhoods where Daniel and I had once lived, seeing the coffee shop where we'd met, driving past the house we'd shared. But it had also been liberating. The woman who'd lived there had been naive and trusting, willing to accept vague answers and convenient explanations. The woman who'd returned was someone who asked hard questions and demanded proof. "Any word from the other teams?" I asked. Maria was presenting in Miami, Jennifer in Los Angeles, and Susan was handling the New York presentation virtually. "All green lights so far." Jennifer said the LAPD was particularly interested in our elderly protection protocols. Marcus's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with a frown. "It's Agent Martinez. She wants to speak with you before the presentation." Agent Martinez had become more than just our FBI contact over the past 3 years. She'd become a mentor, helping me understand the legal complexities of victim advocacy and the business opportunities in cybersecurity. She'd also become something like a friend, though our relationship was complicated by the ongoing investigation into Daniel's associates. "Rachel," Agent Martinez said when I answered, "I have news that might affect your presentation today. We've made arrests in the Denver area." My stomach tightened. "Daniel's partners?" "3 of them, including the man who tried to pick up Caroline's children from school. They've been operating out of a facility in Aurora, using Daniel's client list to continue targeting his victims." The relief was overwhelming. For 3 years, I'd been looking over my shoulder, worried that Daniel's criminal associates might view me as a threat. Every success my company achieved had been shadowed by the fear that someone might try to stop us from exposing their methods. "Are Caroline and the kids safe?" "Everyone's safe." We coordinated the arrests across multiple states. The entire network has been shut down. Caroline had moved to Denver 6 months after Daniel's death, selling the Asheville house and relocating to be closer to our growing business. She'd become our head of victim services, using her natural empathy and hard-won wisdom to help people navigate the aftermath of financial fraud. Tyler and Sophie had adapted to city life with the resilience of children, though Tyler still struggled with anger about his father's deception. "There's something else," Agent Martinez continued. "The arrests are going to generate significant media attention. Your company is going to be mentioned as instrumental in breaking up the network. Are you prepared for that level of visibility?" I looked around the conference room where I'd built something meaningful from the ashes of my destroyed marriage. The walls were covered with thank you letters from victims we'd helped, news articles about our software's effectiveness, and photographs from our team-building retreats. This wasn't just a business anymore, it was a movement. "We're ready," I said. "We've been ready for 3 years." The presentation that afternoon was to a room full of corporate executives, government officials, and law enforcement representatives. 3 years ago, I would have been terrified to speak in front of such an audience. Today, I felt calm and confident, knowing that every word I spoke was backed by expertise earned through the hardest possible experience. Identity theft is often portrayed as a crime of opportunity, I began, clicking to my first slide. But sophisticated operators like the network we helped dismantle don't rely on chance. They rely on psychological manipulation, careful target selection, and the exploitation of human trust. I walked them through Daniel's methods, explaining how he'd chosen victims based on their emotional vulnerabilities and social isolation. I showed them the software tools he'd used to create false identities and the relationship management systems he'd employed to keep his multiple lives organized. Quote, "The traditional approach to fraud prevention focuses on financial monitoring," I continued. "But by the time suspicious transactions appear, the damage is often already done. Our software takes a different approach. We monitor for the behavioral patterns that precede financial fraud." The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions about implementation costs and effectiveness metrics. But the real test came when I reached the personal component of my presentation. "I'm not just the CEO of Sentinel Security Solutions," I said, clicking to a slide that showed before and after photos of Daniel's 5 families. "I'm also a survivor of the criminal network we helped bring down. The man who stole millions of dollars from innocent victims also stole 12 years of my life by convincing me he was someone he wasn't." The room went completely quiet. This was the part of the presentation that Marcus had urged me to cut, worried that it would make me seem too emotionally involved to be objective about our business model. My husband convinced 5 different women that we were his one true love. I continued. He used our relationships as cover for his criminal activities, and he nearly destroyed all of our lives. But he made one crucial mistake. He underestimated us. I clicked to the next slide, which showed the growth of Sentinel Security Solutions over the past 3 years. Revenue, employee count, clients served, fraudulent activities prevented. The women he targeted weren't chosen because we were weak, I said. We were chosen because we were capable, trustworthy, and resourceful. Qualities that made us useful to him also made us dangerous to his entire criminal network once we decided to fight back. The presentation ended with sustained applause, and the questions that followed showed genuine interest from potential clients. But the real victory came afterward, when Agent Martinez approached me with a smile. "That was masterful," she said. "You've just positioned yourself as the leading expert on relationship-based fraud prevention. Every law enforcement agency in the country is going to want to work with you." "Good," I said, "because we're just getting started." That evening, Marcus and I celebrated at a downtown restaurant that had become our unofficial headquarters for important discussions. Our waiter recognized us and automatically brought my usual wine, a small luxury that still felt surreal after years of careful budgeting. "I got a call from the Seattle Police Department while you were presenting," Marcus said. "They want to hire us to consult on a romance scam targeting tech executives." "Seattle's close to Portland," I said thoughtfully. "Caroline might be interested in handling that case personally." Caroline had become an expert in what we called relationship fraud, the specific type of manipulation that Daniel had specialized in. She'd developed training programs for law enforcement and victim advocacy groups, teaching them to recognize the warning signs of intimate partner financial abuse. "There's something else," Marcus said, his expression growing more serious. "I got a call from someone who claims to be Daniel's brother." I nearly choked on my wine. Daniel didn't have a brother. He told all of us his family was dead. That's what I thought. But this man, he says his name is David Barnes, and he has documentation proving they're related. He wants to meet with you. Why me specifically? He says Daniel left something for you. Something he was supposed to deliver if anything ever happened to Daniel. The idea that Daniel might have had genuine family members, people who'd been excluded from his criminal life, opened up possibilities I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. Every time I thought I'd uncovered all of Daniel's secrets, something new emerged to complicate the narrative. Did this David say what Daniel left for me? A letter. And apparently some kind of evidence that explains why Daniel started the identity theft operation in the first place. I set down my wine glass and stared out the restaurant window at the Denver skyline. 3 years ago, I would have jumped at any chance to understand Daniel's motivations, to find some explanation that might make his betrayal hurt less. But the woman I'd become was more cautious about reopening old wounds. Quote, "What do you think?" I asked Marcus. "I think you've built something incredible from the worst experience of your life," he said carefully. "And I think you need to decide whether learning more about Daniel's past would help or hurt what you're trying to accomplish." That night, I walked through my downtown loft apartment, thinking about the choices that had brought me to this point. The space was modern and minimalist, nothing like the cluttered home I'd shared with Daniel in Portland. Every piece of furniture had been chosen deliberately, every decoration placed with intention. It was the home of someone who'd learned to trust her own judgment. The walls held framed articles about Sentinel security solutions, photographs from company events, and artwork created by local artists I'd commissioned. There were no pictures of Daniel, no remnants of my previous life, except for a single item, the scrap of paper where I'd written the Mountain View Drive address in my own handwriting. I'd kept it as a reminder of how far I'd traveled, both literally and metaphorically. The woman who'd written that address had been desperate for answers, willing to drive 800 miles to solve a mystery that had already shattered her world. The woman looking at it now had turned that mystery into a mission that employed dozens of people and protected thousands of potential victims. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "Saw the news about the arrests. Tyler wants to know if this means we can finally stop looking over our shoulders." I typed back, "Tell him yes, the nightmare is officially over." But even as I sent the message, I wondered if that was entirely true. Daniel's brother, if he really existed, represented one more thread connecting me to a past I'd spent 3 years transforming into purpose. Whatever letter Daniel had left, whatever evidence David Barnes claimed to possess, it had the potential to reopen questions I'd finally stopped asking. The rational part of me wanted to ignore David's request for a meeting. I'd built a successful life without needing to understand every detail of Daniel's psychology or motivation. But another part of me, the part that had driven 800 miles to Asheville 3 years ago, was curious about what final revelation Daniel might have intended for me. I picked up my phone and called Marcus. "Set up the meeting," I said when he answered. "But make it here, in Denver, in our office. And make sure Agent Martinez knows about it." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Whatever Daniel left for me, whatever his brother wants to tell me, it's not going to change who I've become. But it might help me understand how to help other people who are where I used to be." The next morning brought news that our presentation had generated 3 new contracts and inquiries from federal agencies about expanding our services. Maria called from Miami with similar results, and Jennifer reported that the Los Angeles presentation had led to a partnership opportunity with a major insurance company. We'd done it. We'd taken the worst thing that had ever happened to us and transformed it into something that would prevent it from happening to others. We'd turned our victimization into expertise, our trauma into triumph. Whatever David Barnes wanted to tell me about his brother, whatever final secret Daniel had wanted me to know, it would have to compete with the reality of what I'd already accomplished. And that reality was pretty impressive. Standing in my office, looking out at the mountains that had become my new horizon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in my own judgment. The woman who'd believed Daniel's lies was gone. The woman who'd replaced her had learned to verify everything, trust carefully, and build her life on foundations that couldn't be shaken by someone else's deception. David Barnes could bring his letter and his evidence. I was ready for whatever Daniel's final revelation might be. Because I'd already solved the only mystery that really mattered: who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's lies. David Barnes arrived at our Denver office on a Thursday morning in September, carrying a weathered leather briefcase and wearing the kind of nervous expression that suggested he'd been rehearsing this conversation for years. He was shorter than Daniel had been, with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of manual labor, but the resemblance around the eyes was unmistakable. Marcus had arranged for Agent Martinez to be present, though she'd agreed to observe from our conference room's adjoining office unless her intervention became necessary. I wanted this conversation to happen, but I also wanted protection if David turned out to be another criminal associate rather than genuine family. "Mrs. Barnes," David said, extending his hand formally, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this must be difficult." "It's Ms. Mitchell now," I corrected gently. "I've gone back to my maiden name. And please, call me Rachel." David nodded, setting his briefcase on the conference table with careful precision. "I should start by proving who I am, I suppose. I brought documentation." He opened the briefcase and withdrew a folder containing birth certificates, childhood photographs, and military records. The evidence was convincing. David Michael Barnes, born 2 years before Daniel, both children of Robert and Susan Barnes of Knoxville, Tennessee. The photographs showed 2 boys who were clearly brothers, though David had always been stockier and more serious, while Daniel possessed the easy charm that had fooled so many people. Daniel told everyone his family was dead. Quote, I said, studying a photo of the brothers as teenagers. "Why would he lie about having a brother?" David's expression darkened. "Because he was ashamed. And because I'd spent 15 years trying to get him to stop running scams and live an honest life." He pulled out another folder, this one thick with documents that looked official and ominous. "Rachel, my brother didn't start stealing identities because he was greedy or sociopathic. He started because he was trying to protect our parents from a medical bankruptcy that would have destroyed them." The story David told over the next hour painted a picture of Daniel that was more complex than the monster I'd created in my mind. Their father had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's when Daniel was 25. Their mother had developed cancer the same year. The medical bills had been catastrophic, even with insurance, and the family had faced losing their home and their father's small business. Daniel was always the smart one, the one who understood computers and financial systems, David explained. He started small, just creating fake identities to get additional insurance coverage for our parents. Treatments. He told himself it was temporary, just until the medical crisis passed. But it didn't stop there, I said, though I was beginning to understand the trajectory. Our mother died anyway. The cancer was too aggressive, and our father's condition deteriorated rapidly after losing her. Daniel had gotten good at identity theft, and he'd discovered how lucrative it could be. He said he was going to make enough money to put our father in the best care facility available, then go straight. David reached into his briefcase again and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with wax. But Daniel never went straight. The money was too easy, and he'd convinced himself that he was only stealing from people who could afford it. By the time our father died 5 years ago, Daniel had built his operation into something I couldn't even comprehend. "Did you know about the families? About me and Caroline and the others?" "I knew there were women. Daniel would mention girlfriends sometimes, though he was always vague about details. I thought he was just commitment phobic, the way some men are after trauma." David's voice was heavy with regret. "I had no idea he was married to any of you, let alone 5 of you." I felt a strange mix of emotions. Learning that Daniel's crimes had begun from desperation rather than pure greed didn't excuse what he'd done to us, but it made him seem more human, more like someone who'd made increasingly terrible choices rather than a predator who'd targeted us from the beginning. "What's in the envelope?" I asked. "A letter Daniel wrote to you about 6 months before he died. He gave it to me with instructions to deliver it if anything happened to him." David hesitated. He also gave me information about where he'd hidden assets that weren't connected to his criminal activities. Clean money that he wanted you to have. My hands trembled slightly as I took the envelope. The wax seal bore the impression of a ring I recognized, one Daniel had always worn but claimed was just a college graduation gift. Apparently it had been their father's ring, passed down through generations of Barnes men. The letter inside was written in Daniel's careful handwriting on expensive paper, as if he'd wanted this final communication to feel permanent and significant. "Rachel," it began, "if you're reading this, then my life has caught up with me in a way that makes honesty both possible and necessary. I'm writing this while sitting in our Portland kitchen, watching you work on a client proposal at the table where we've shared thousands of meals. You're completely absorbed in your work, occasionally tucking a strand of hair behind your ear in the way that always makes me wish I was a better man." I had to pause, the intimacy of the observation hitting me unexpectedly. This wasn't the voice of a criminal cataloging his victims. This was someone who genuinely observed and cared about the small details of my life. "I need you to understand that loving you was never part of the plan," the letter continued. "You were supposed to be temporary, a convenient cover while I established operations on the West Coast. But somewhere between our third date and our first anniversary, you became the person I looked forward to seeing every day. You became home in a way I'd never experienced before." The words were beautiful and heartbreaking, but they also raised more questions. If Daniel had truly loved me, how had he justified the deception? How had he reconciled his feelings with the systematic betrayal our marriage represented? I know you'll ask why I didn't just leave the criminal life behind once I realized I loved you. The answer is complicated and probably insufficient. By the time we met, I was in too deep to simply walk away. I had obligations to the people I worked with, debts that couldn't be settled with an apology and a promise to reform. More than that, I had become addicted to the complexity of managing multiple identities. It gave me a sense of control that I'd never felt in my legitimate life. I looked up at David, who was watching me read with an expression of deep sadness. Did he really work with other criminals, or was he operating alone? "Both," David said. "Daniel had partners in the technical aspects of identity theft, but the family arrangements were his own innovation. His associates thought he was brilliant for creating such elaborate cover stories. They had no idea he'd actually married any of you." The letter continued for several more pages, detailing Daniel's increasing guilt about his double life and his failed attempts to find a way out that wouldn't destroy everyone he cared about. He wrote about Caroline and the children with genuine affection, describing Tyler's intelligence and Sophie's musical talent in ways that suggested real pride, rather than calculated manipulation. "The hardest part isn't maintaining the lies," he wrote. "It's knowing that each of you deserves better than half of a man's attention and love. Caroline deserves a husband who's present for every school play and soccer game. You deserve a partner who's completely honest about his past and his dreams for the future. I've stolen that possibility from all of you, and I don't know how to give it back without destroying everything." The final section of the letter contains specific information about bank accounts, investments, and property that Daniel had purchased under his real name before his criminal activities began. Clean assets totaling nearly $400,000 that he wanted divided among his families. "This money came from legitimate work I did in my 20s, the letter explained. Construction consulting and woodworking commissions that had nothing to do with identity theft. It's not enough to compensate for what I've taken from you, but it's something. Use it to build the life you would have had if you'd never met me." The letter was signed simply Daniel, with a postscript that made my throat tight. "You have more strength and intelligence than you realize. I've watched you handle every challenge our marriage has brought with grace and determination. Whatever happens next, don't let my failures define your possibilities." I set the letter down and looked at David, who'd been waiting patiently while I processed his brother's final words. "The money he mentioned," I said, "is it really clean?" "Completely. I've had accountants and lawyers verify every transaction. Daniel kept meticulous records of his legitimate earnings, separate from his criminal activities." David reached into his briefcase one more time and withdrew a thick folder. "Account numbers, investment statements, property deeds. Everything you need to access what he left for you." Marcus had been quietly observing from across the table, but now he spoke up. "Rachel, this could change everything for the company. $400,000 would let us expand into new markets, hire additional developers." "But I was thinking about something else entirely. David, you said Daniel wanted this money divided among his families. That includes Caroline and the children, Maria and her kids, Jennifer and Susan." "Daniel specifically mentioned that you should decide how to distribute it," David said. "He trusted your judgment more than anyone else's." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at downtown Denver while I processed everything I'd learned. Daniel's letter had complicated my understanding of our relationship, introducing genuine emotion into what I'd assumed was pure manipulation. But it hadn't changed the fundamental facts. He'd lied to me for 12 years, stolen years of my life, and put me at risk through his criminal activities. More importantly, it hadn't changed who I'd become in response to those betrayals. The woman standing in this office was stronger, smarter, and more capable than the woman Daniel had married. She'd built something meaningful from the ashes of his deception, and she had the power to help other people do the same. "David," I said, turning back to face him. "I want to accept Daniel's money, but not for myself. I want to use it to create a foundation that helps victims of relationship fraud rebuild their lives." Marcus smiled, recognizing the determined tone that meant I'd made an irreversible decision. "The Daniel Barnes Foundation for Fraud Victims?" "No," I said firmly. "The Phoenix Foundation. Because sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having your old life burned down completely." David's eyes filled with tears. "Daniel would have liked that. He always said you were the strongest person he knew, even though you didn't know it yourself." Agent Martinez emerged from the adjoining office, where she'd been listening to our conversation. "Rachel, I have to ask. Are you sure you want to take this money? Daniel's criminal enterprise hurt a lot of people. Some might see accepting his assets as profiting from his crimes." "The money predates his criminal activities," I said, "and it's going to be used to help his victims. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with my legal team." Over the next several weeks, the Phoenix Foundation became reality with a speed that surprised even me. Maria flew in from Miami to help design our victim assistance programs. Carolyn developed training modules for law enforcement agencies. Jennifer created marketing materials that would help us reach potential beneficiaries. And Susan established partnerships with legal aid organizations across the country. The Foundation's mission was simple: provide immediate financial assistance to victims of relationship fraud while they rebuilt their lives, along with counseling services and job training programs. We wanted to be the resource we'd wished for during our darkest moments, the organization that could help people transition from victim to survivor to advocate. Our first major initiative was a conference for fraud victims, law enforcement professionals, and financial institutions. The event sold out within 3 days of opening registration, with attendees flying in from across the country to learn about fraud prevention and victim recovery. I gave the opening keynote speech, standing before an audience of 800 people who represented every aspect of the financial crime ecosystem. Many were victims like me, still processing their experiences and looking for ways to move forward. Others were professionals seeking better tools and techniques for helping their clients. 3.5 years ago, I began. I received a phone call that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. My husband of 12 years had died in a car accident, but his final words led me to discover that he'd been living multiple lives, supporting multiple families, and running a sophisticated criminal operation that had victimized hundreds of people. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word as I described the journey from that devastating phone call to the creation of Sentinel Security Solutions and the Phoenix Foundation. The man who betrayed me thought he was choosing women who would be easy to manipulate and control, I continued. He was wrong about that, but he was right about one thing. He chose women who were resourceful, intelligent, and capable of extraordinary things when motivated by purpose. I clicked to a slide showing the impact our organizations had achieved. Sentinel Security Solutions had prevented over $30 million in fraudulent transactions. The Phoenix Foundation had provided assistance to more than 1,500 victims of relationship fraud. Our training programs had educated thousands of law enforcement professionals about the psychological tactics used by sophisticated criminals. The question isn't whether you'll recover from financial fraud, I told the audience. The question is what you'll build with the strength you discover during that recovery. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but the real validation came afterward, during the networking reception. Victim after victim approached me to share their stories and ask for advice. Many had already begun their own advocacy efforts, turning their experiences into expertise that could help others. One woman, a retired teacher named Helen, had been targeted by a romance scammer who'd stolen her pension savings. Instead of retreating into isolation, she'd started a blog documenting romance scam tactics that now reached thousands of readers monthly. Another attendee, a divorced father named Robert, had lost his small business when his identity was stolen by someone who opened fraudulent accounts in his name. He'd spent 2 years fighting to restore his credit, and now he was developing software to help other small business owners protect themselves from similar attacks. Every conversation reinforced my conviction that Daniel had made a crucial miscalculation when he'd assumed his victims would remain passive. We'd taken our pain and transformed it into power, our trauma into triumph, our isolation into community. Caroline found me near the end of the reception, Tyler and Sophie flanking her like bodyguards. Both children had grown tremendously in the past few years, Tyler now taller than his mother and Sophie showing signs of the strong woman she was becoming. "The kids wanted to tell you something," Caroline said, nudging them forward. Tyler stepped up first, his teenage awkwardness making him shuffle his feet as he spoke. "I wanted to thank you for making something good come out of what happened with our dad. I know it would have been easier to just try to forget everything, but you didn't. You made it matter." Sophie was more direct, as always. "I'm going to study computer science in college so I can help catch bad guys like our dad used to be. Maybe I'll work for your company someday." Their words hit me with unexpected force. These children had every reason to be bitter about their father's betrayal and the disruption it had caused in their lives. Instead, they'd chosen to see meaning in the aftermath, to find inspiration in the way their family and friends had responded to tragedy. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing alone on the hotel's rooftop terrace, looking out at the Denver skyline that had become home. Marcus joined me after a few minutes, carrying 2 glasses of champagne from the reception. "Penny, for your thoughts," he said, handing me a glass. "I was thinking about Daniel's letter, about what he said about not knowing how to give us back what he'd stolen without destroying everything. And? He was wrong. He didn't steal our possibilities, he just delayed them." I raised my glass toward the mountains. "Look what we built once we stopped letting him define our limitations." Marcus clinked his glass against mine. "To not letting anyone else define our limitations. To Phoenix moments," I corrected. "To the beautiful things that grow from ashes." The next morning brought a phone call that would have terrified the woman I'd been 4 years ago. A producer from a national news program wanted to interview me about relationship fraud, specifically about how victims could transform their experiences into advocacy and empowerment. "We've been following your story," she explained, "the way you've built multiple successful organizations from such a devastating personal experience. Our viewers need to hear that recovery is possible, that there's life after financial fraud. 4 years ago, I would have declined immediately. The thought of sharing my story on national television would have seemed impossible, too exposing, too risky. But the woman I'd become understood that visibility was power, that storytelling was a form of service. "I'll do the interview," I said. "But I want to include Caroline and the other women. This isn't just my story, it's our story." The interview aired 3 weeks later, during prime time on a major network. All 5 of Daniel's former wives appeared together for the first time, sharing our experiences and the organizations we'd built in response to them. The producer had woven our individual stories into a narrative about resilience, community, and the unexpected gifts that sometimes emerge from betrayal. The response was overwhelming. Our foundation's website crashed from traffic within hours of the broadcast. Sentinel Security Solutions received hundreds of inquiries from potential clients. Most importantly, victims of similar crimes reached out from across the country, ready to begin their own journeys from devastation to empowerment. But the moment that mattered most came at the very end of the interview, when the host asked what I wanted viewers to remember about our story. "I want them to remember that the people who hurt us don't get to write the endings of our stories," I said, looking directly into the camera. "We do. And those endings can be more beautiful than anything we originally planned." That night, I returned to my apartment and sat at the kitchen table where I did my best thinking. The scrap of paper with Daniel's Mountain View Drive address was still tucked into my wallet, but I no longer needed the reminder it represented. I'd traveled far beyond that desperate woman who'd driven 800 miles searching for answers to questions that would have destroyed her. Instead, I'd become someone who created answers for other people facing similar devastation. Someone who'd learned that the most powerful response to betrayal wasn't revenge or withdrawal, but transformation. Someone who understood that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the foundation for the best thing you ever do. I pulled out my laptop and began writing an email to David Barnes, Daniel's brother, who'd become an unexpected ally in our victim advocacy work. David, I wrote, I wanted to let you know that the Phoenix Foundation received its largest donation today. An anonymous gift of $50,000 from someone who said they were inspired by our story. I think Daniel would be amazed by what his failures have inspired. He thought he was stealing our futures, but he actually gave us the motivation to build something bigger than we ever would have attempted in our comfortable old lives. I paused, thinking about the woman who'd answered that devastating phone call 4 years ago, then continued writing. I finally figured out what Daniel's dying words really meant. When he told me to go to Mountain View Drive and tell them Daniel sent me, he wasn't just asking me to deliver news of his death, he was sending me toward the people who would help me discover who I really was underneath all his lies. He was giving me the gift of finding my true family, the community of survivors who would understand exactly what I'd been through and help me transform it into purpose. Thank you for bringing me his letter and the foundation money. But mostly thank you for helping me understand that even the worst betrayals can become unexpected gifts if we're brave enough to unwrap them properly. I signed the email, sent it, and closed my laptop. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help victims become advocates, new chances to prove that Phoenix moments were real and available to anyone willing to do the difficult work of rising from ashes. Tonight I was simply grateful to be exactly who I'd become, in exactly the life I'd built, surrounded by exactly the people who'd helped me discover what was possible when I stopped letting someone else's limitations define my own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.